Marco Obiso, which is the head of the Cybersecurity Division of the International Telecommunication Union, which is the agency of the United Nations that sets all the standards and all fields. It's back in 1890. 80, 60 something. So it's the first agency, it's the first global agency that was established. And so he has a cross-sectoral area on cybersecurity. So welcome, Marco.
Thank you. So I didn't have anything prepared, so we just go as it comes, right? Yeah, so as Rufo was saying, I'm Marco and I'm from the oldest, it's in UN agency in the world. And by way of introduction, I wanted to thank Rufo and the Canton and for hosting this event. And I wanted to immediately link the discussion that Michael and Rufo and the others are having also during the lunch, which is why we need this element of what we call trustless, or this element of trust. And the manifestation of the why is actually what we were mentioning, the fact that companies, international organizations, governments, citizens, they are trying to create platforms or mechanisms where they can say we share the same principle, we share the same ideas, we share the same approach in seeing how we can actually make the best use of ICTs. And at the end of the day, I firmly believe that whatever thing we do, it comes back to how, as human beings, we are designed. Because if we were designed in a different way, we were not going to be here to discuss why we need to cooperate. If we were designed in a different way, we didn't have nations, we didn't have all this fragmentation that is happening everywhere in any human group. So we need to deal with the fact that we are designed as we are, okay? And we need to try to achieve a concept or an understanding that we need to accept that, and we need to try to create any kind of a mechanism that will help us to go beyond how we are, genetically designed. Some people tend to forget that because they just go into initially, they just create something without thinking on why they are doing that. And some of the organizations that you were mentioning are actually doing that. Maybe for commercial purposes, maybe for purposes that are more related to political visibility or political positioning, but the real why, they're not addressing that. That's why we are seeing, I think for the past maybe 5-10 years, I would say between 50 and 100 organizations that are claimed to be global in nature. But as a matter of fact, they are not. Okay? And they are not because they don't take into account the fundamental elements of what they want to address. Okay? Now, we don't have this problem as UN because by default UN is supposed to be an agreement that it comes from the membership, even if most of the time they don't agree on anything. That's why we are so slow. But the principle of having an institutional mandate that tells, okay, our kind of decision makers are agreeing on a process, it gives a little bit of more power in terms of negotiating, right? So, why I'm saying all this? Because I'm coming from a standard setting organization and I was supposed to talk about standards, but I think that the discussion here goes a little bit beyond the standard as an element. I think the discussion here is to how we can, as a community, as a global community, instigate the process for which we have a fundamental principle injecting in everything we are doing that is based on trust. And this is something that is missing almost everywhere. So even on the standard setting, you have national standard setting bodies, you have international standard setting bodies, you have regional standard setting bodies. And if you see the standards that are delivered or produced, there is no compliance, there is very, very, very little compatibility between the different standards. And even if the standard negotiated at international level are adopting on a specific digital or technology platform. Now, there was a movement in terms of standard setting into having something that is technology neutral, that is network neutral. Sometimes it happens, sometimes not. We have a very, very big historical case where on a certain moment, GSM was going in one direction and whatever we had in the North America was going in another direction. That created big, huge problem in terms of compatibility. There was an alignment, but this was a case where you have actually two different standards running at the same time. So again, this is because some of us believe that there is no a comprehensive approach in how we do things. Okay. Now, one kind of a current, one trend is saying, okay, this comprehensive approach has to be negotiated at the UN level. So you have something that UN is encompassing as set of principles to say this is how we see information and communication technologies. And that goes back as some of the basis to something that Michael was mentioning, confidence building measure, elements that would reduce or mitigate the risk of having different nations doing different things. But this also is linked to the assumption that I did before. It is inevitable that countries and governments and nations and regions, they go in a different direction. So we need to try to harmonize what is happening and try to come out with a set of principles that will take into account the pockets of processes that are happening at the regional and international level, even at the national level, and try to create a broker element, a middleware where everything is encapsulated and it can come out with a level of compatibility. So I don't want to go too technical here, but there is lots of work to be done in terms of adding an additional layer, even if sometimes it's seen as an overhead, to try to take into account what is produced or generated as what we call standard, and create a compatibility element. All work that is related to conformance, compliance, interoperability, all this is a kind of an effort that the different organizations, as International Standardization Organization, ISO, IETF, and whoever is dealing with the ICT is trying to do. And I would say that there is a kind of a common understanding that this is something that is needed and this is the way to go. Because I think there is a fundamental realization that having one single standard that covers everything will be almost impossible to achieve. So there is building our digital utopia. Okay, that's something that we may aim to. My feeling is that we will not have it. We will not have it. My feeling is that we are going to have something where we agree on the principle, but then the implementation of this principle is done according to how we are designed to be, which is related to the culture, to the religion, to the sex, to the color of our skin, and to how we live and in which specific community and society we live. I don't know if I have more time.
You still have a few minutes, yeah.
All right. So that is I think it's an element that has to be taken into account in terms of how the world, I mean, when I say the world, I mean the governmental world is working, all right? So there are lots of effort in terms of conformance, and these include also conformance not only on standards that we consider merely technical, but also on principles that we consider more related to policies. And this comes back to the element of confidence building, because we are seeing a movement in trying to every time see how we can weaponize a specific element that is coming from the ICTs. So one thing is malicious code that is written to steal your money, which is fine because as we say in Italy, you write the law and you find the workaround to undertake or to bypass the law. So this is something that again is part of how we are designed. So we need to accept that. Okay? But there is another element which is a little bit more dangerous, which is how malicious code can be used to actually interact with something that can generate a physical threat. And this is something that is we are seeing more and more, okay? If you are following the discussion about drones, the discussion about, the dual use of AI, you will see that there is always there an element to transpose what is happening in the virtual world into the physical world. That's why the international community is trying to apply the international law, whether it's virtual or physical doesn't matter, because they are starting to understand that there is a need to encompass what is actually criminalized as a physical action and what is criminalized as a virtual action. So there is this kind of extension of having an approach of compliance or an approach of kind of international principles that is applied at the technical level, at the behavioral element, but also at the policy level. There are some, just to give the example, some tools that we can use that is coming from the technology. Digital identity. Okay, I don't know how much you're familiar with this, but this is something that most of the governments and most of the regions and most of the international organizations are addressing. Why? Because this is one of the fundamental elements that could contribute to this kind of trusted network. Okay? So digital identity is basically, the transposition of who I am in the physical world into the digital world, into the virtual world. Okay? And why this is important? Because it gives basically authority of me as a human being to be recognized also in the digital world. Now, there are thousands of digital identity processes when you log on your mobile, when you do a subscription on your Nintendo Switch or PS3 or PS4, or whatever you do on your bank account. These are creating digital identities all over self. The issue here is to try to, at least at the national level, to aggregate this with the concept of having only one identity that is kind of a single sign-on on any platform. And we consider this as a fundamental element, at least one of the pillars to go in the direction to create this kind of a trust. Okay? So I wanted just to touch on that because I wanted to maybe give you, I don't know if I managed to do that, share it in a concrete example of what could be the enablers to achieve that kind of, I don't want to say universal trust, but at least the most agreed process toward having a trusted environment. And I'll stop here because otherwise I'm monopolized the session, but I think we have
Thank you for Marco for highlighting a wider context of the discussion of this event, which encompasses what we are doing as a community. Because now IT is getting so central. We're not just creating technology for some marginal thing, but it's becoming central, and so it's really a choice also. To what extent also we do things at a global level and at a local level, because as humans we're different, we're maintaining this difference, and there's something in political science that is called subsidiarity, which is the principle by which in democracy you should take decisions at the global level when they're needed to be at the local level, and as low level as you can if possible. And so absolutely I think that the creation of some proper global standards need to be also taken into account this need and so on and so forth. So you shouldn't exaggerate in either direction for sure. Great. So now moving to an introduction. Please go ahead. You want to ask me or Marco? Please go ahead. Sure.
Okay. You mentioned that one of the goals for national governments is, you spoke about digital ID as a fundamental element of the, you didn't say the word infrastructure, but I'll say the infrastructure of trust.
Well, yeah, it's one of the
elements. Okay.
Yes, it's not the only one. Yeah.
Right, and you mentioned the idea that you have one idea for single sign-on because you have many ideas everywhere to sign for it. But wouldn't that be quite dangerous, and would it be better to do what in fact people do more and more for credit cards, where in fact you are going towards the other direction, where you're creating for every purchase a random ID, so that nobody can hijack that ID, and that therefore you have it's completely anonymous, it's connected to you, but it's just a one-time ID for a particular transaction. So this way you have more safety, and because what you're saying, it seems that if you're just one ID for single sign-on, doesn't that increase the risk?
Okay. So I think there is a little bit of confusion between how the transaction is performed. Okay. Sorry, there is a little bit of confusion on how the transaction is performed and the principle of kind of unified digital identity. What you're mentioning is a mechanism of authentication, which is, differentiating from the concept of having, one, let's say, identity that is saying that I am who I am in the digital world. So the generation of, let's say, a temporary identity for a specific transaction, this is really happening. When, I don't know if you have UBS, in UBS account on a banking, it works with 2 or 3 factor authentication, and every time that you authenticate, you basically generate one single token that can be associated to your identity. But your identity digitally doesn't change, you see? So when you start performing operations, then you have different mechanism of how yourself digitally is basically recognized within the infrastructure that you are using. Okay, so that's good, and I think is a good point, and this is actually something that is really happening. What I was mentioning as a single sign-on, which is of course a simplification, because I don't expect that I come to Switzerland and then if I had 2 bank accounts, the 2 banks will agree and will say, okay, I give you just one digital. No, this is not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is that there is an element of compliance and interoperability in terms of having, like what is happening in India, which is a very, very good example, it's called Aadhaar. The governments give one. Well, there are then issues about privacy, but then the discussion will carry on until after tomorrow. But the concept is to have a person, okay, let's say associated or affiliated with one single digital ID process. Okay, so whether it's a card or it's a token or it's something that exists only in the virtual world, the overall idea is to have a person that is, uniquely recognized. Okay, now the extreme privacy people are saying, okay, if you do that, then we track your account, we track your memories, we track your transaction. Okay. But the other side is say, yes, that's true, but if you are a criminal, we track your criminal activities, we track, so all this discussion is still open. But again, for me, we need to separate the discussion from the conceptual element, which is something that I think, well, I believe personally, I think is extremely useful. The fact that, as you said, we can differentiate, we can, go by transaction, we can go by, simple elements of authentication, but there should be a fundamental understanding or a key understanding that we need to start aggregating all these fragmented elements that are around the world.
But I think that kind of one of the core questions is not answered, which is the fact that all of my data and everything just is one. This is the risk, because I just now have one single point. Like if I'm a criminal, you get me, but if I'm a normal person, if somebody steals that, now I have a huge problem. But it's also the question that in reality, in my normal life, I do have more than one identity.
Correct.
This is inherent to me and my personality. I have a very different identity when I'm at university and here than when I was this weekend at home in Spain. And the fact that on some level it's being imposed, that now all of these have to be merged in one, created very huge dissonance with respect to our social and democratic procedures in the physical world and this digital world that we want.
Okay, so again, this is a very good discussion. I don't know if you want
I think you give a quick answer and then we keep on this.
So the quick answer is, again, is a little bit of a misunderstanding. Maybe it's me that I'm not properly communicating. Since you are Spanish, I'm Italian. Maybe if we switch to another language, we can understand each other, right? No, just kidding. But okay, so I think most of the digital identity frameworks that are built are not built with a single point of failure, what we call it, which is centralizing all data. Because of course, I don't know if you are a technician or if you are a cybersecurity expert, but even for the normal people, we say, okay, we put everything here. If I access, of course, I have everything, right? So the idea is not to centralize the source of data. The idea is to centralize and to create a layer where my access to my digital services is easy and is seamless. Okay, so the idea is that, from my perspective, for example, and it's just my personal, preference. You might have a different. I would prefer to have one card that is accessing my e-health services, my governmental services, my account for the bus, my account for the bank, my account. Okay, so I think that I could say statistically.
That card is the central point of failure.
No, the card is not the central point of failure, because the central point of failure is if the card is used to access every time the same service with the same source of data beyond. So the central point of failure is always something that we know, some things that we have, and this comes back to the authentication part, okay? So generally, the digital ID processes are done not just with the, I have the card, I put the card somewhere, then I dial 1, 2, 3, and then I access to the services. It's always related to biometrics, for example. This is the digital, no, it's not a digital ID, but you know, if you have this card and you don't have my fingerprint, you cannot access my premises, okay? So, there are, and again, I don't want to go into the technical.
I think that's,
so there are
fair enough.
The technical.
Yeah.
Okay. So the level of authentication for a specific token, whether it's this one or is USB key or is a biometric, is not only with one process of authentication. Okay. Generally, and this comes back to the basic of cybersecurity. Generally, you be authenticated with who you are, what you know, and what you possess. You know that, right?
Yeah, she was.
I know that.
Yes, exactly. So if you say that, and if you know that, then the single point of failure is eliminated, or at least is reduced. Okay. Now, of course, it's better to have one mechanism of authentication for one service, another one for another service, another one for another service. Because if you take one, then you don't have the others. But we can eliminate this even if we have an element of commonality, that is the middleware, or that is some kind of a framework that would allow the mitigation of this. Because on the other side, it is true that if you have 3 or 4, in order to access your entire patrimonio, how to say patrimonio?
Patrimony.
Yeah, I need to access all the different things. That is also true. But sometimes, or at least for some people, the risk is mitigated on the other side. But again, this is a discussion.
Okay. So thanks a lot.